Hello everyone, this is one of my matches from the Winner Mox Moto League for Australian 7-point Highlander. This match was me playing again the Hot Wheels deck, or Blue-Red Aggro, with the Wheel of Fortune Time Twister package, and I was playing against Grixis, Thassa's Oracle, Underworld Breach, with Laris as a companion. This is, I think, a sort of fundamentally not great matchup, but certainly you have a few key cards that matter quite a lot that they can struggle to deal with, and at the end of the day, you can always Hull Breach or Time Twister them on turn 2 with the advance of a Mox. So this is game 1. My opponent wins the die roll. They reveal their companion. This hand is obviously unplayable, so we ship it. And this hand normally is sort of very good. Here it's actually potentially insane because you have Eidolon the Great Revel on turn 1, and their deck, I think they play, I'll put deck list in the description obviously, but usually they play a very small number of spells that actually interact with this. So, a Lightning Bolt, a Fatal Push, and then not too many other spells. And in terms of what you're shipping back, like Royal Silence does nothing in this matchup. Grim Lavamancer also doesn't do a lot, but at least it only costs 1 mana, and it might deal them some life points of damage, quickly rather than very slowly. So we ship the Royal Scions. Our opponent takes their turn, and you see they're going to play a Bauble, so they're replacing actual lands with cantrips, baubles, other things that draw cards. So Eidolon on the play obviously is much better than on the draw, but even on the draw can be potentially very good against them, especially because they may well need to cantrip for a couple of turns to set up a kill on turn 3 or 4. But sadly, our opponent has a Duress, and it turns out when this hand doesn't have Mox Ruby in it, it's significantly worse. So goodbye Mox Ruby. No 2-drop on turn 1. We play a Lavamancer on turn 1 instead, unless we draw something great. This hand suddenly feels a lot worse and significantly less impactful on what our opponent wants to do. So we rip Sprite Dragon. Prismatic Vista is going to play Lavamancer, and we're also in this situation where we don't even want to pay mana to activate Lavamancer because we're so constrained on it. Your opponent's not playing mana dorks that are high impact to kill or anything like that. And then our Lavamancer gets Mental Misstepped, which I thought was just, the cherry on top, because now I'm looking at a 1-land hand with 2-drops and 3-drops. But we'll see what happens. Hopefully we draw something good. Our opponent does this Noxious Revival trick with the fetch land they cracked, and then a cantrip. They play Preordain? Yeah, Preordain, in order to ensure they hit their land drop this turn. Noxious Revival, I think, is a bit of a sort of, 50-50 inclusion in these decks, but it does let you do quite a lot of cute, make sure I hit my land drop, or Fate Seal my opponent with a card from their graveyard the turn before I go off type things. And it certainly worked quite well here. So opponent plays their Delta and ships the turn. Notably, this is 4 damage if Eidolon had been allowed to be in play. Mental Misstep would have cost them an extra 2 damage along the way. We draw a Spirebluff Canal, which is a pretty fortunate draw. We don't have that many untapped sources to cast Eidolon off. And we stick it. So I'm thinking, yeah, cool, maybe we're in with a shot. Here, our opponent Mental Notes or Thought Scours, one of the two. Thought Scours in response. And again, this would have been an extra 2 points of damage if this had been played last turn. But with when they flip cards, they hit Fatal Push, and I'm sort of thinking, okay, that's one of the few interaction pieces they have for this card down. There was no Daze, no Spell Snare. I'm sort of thinking, well, maybe Eidolon will go a significant way towards winning the game, especially because I've got Legion Warboss in my hand. If I draw a land, that takes over the game pretty quickly. My opponent gambles, which is very scary when I have Eidolon in play because they're paying a mana to put a card in their graveyard. And they do not discard a card of significance. They discard Mental Notes. They probably have an answer to this in their hand, and because they flipped Fatal Push, it's probably Underworld Breach. But I'm not quite sure. It could have been a different card. I'm not actually sure what I would gamble for here in this situation if I was playing this deck. But they play Watergrave and ship the turn. They could have feasibly gambled for a land if they already had Breach, or they could have gambled for LAD if they had Breach, etc. Okay, so So we do draw a land, and then there's this decision about whether or not we're Exquisite Firecrafting or Legion Warbossing. I thought a lot about it, and Firecraft gives our opponent less spells, so we put them to 8, with the Firecraft, we put them to 6 with the attack, and this means they're allowed to cast exactly 2 spells. But the problem is if they have an answer to Eidolon, they can get out of that. Even if they have Breach plus Fatal Push, they still get out of that from 2 spells, and they have 2 life. We can't kill them from 2 life. It doesn't seem significantly better than playing Warboss, because if I play Firecraft, put them to 8, attack them to 6, they're still not dead the turn after that. They could just play a land, play a spell, say go, and then kill this in my end step, and I think from 1 life go off. It is a bit unclear. Maybe they need a spell to set up the kill on Eidolon. So maybe it is safer to just Firecraft them, but I think the decision I came to was to just Warboss, and then they have to kill me this turn. Now they definitely don't have a second turn, because they're at 7 life if they kill this, and then this attacks for 5 next turn, putting them to 3, and then Firecraft is lethal. Unfortunately, our opponent does indeed have the way to win the games. They have Breach, and then they have Fatal Push in the graveyard to kill Eidolon in the Great Revel, and then so Eidolon goes away. And at this point, I was thinking, well, they must have to win. They have to have LAD in hand, which was exactly what they had, because now they have no mana to really do anything significant. Even if they gamble, even if they have land gamble, they have to hit LAD with the gamble, I believe. So gamble, you bin 1, 2, 3, and you put LAD in, you bin 1, 2, 3, and then you don't have enough cards to go off, I believe. Maybe I mathed it wrong. But they had land, LAD, and now it's academic. They gamble for Brain Freeze, it goes to the bin, they Brain Freeze with the Tundra, and that's the game. I make them show me the Brain Freeze, just because I'm obnoxious, but yeah, this is a fairly standard kill from this point. Okay, so game 1 didn't go terribly well. Sideboarding wise, I have a few hate cards in the sideboard. Actually, just look at them now. There are a few hate cards in the sideboard that are quite reasonable. This is a more recent build of the list. The Ashiok was not in there when I played this league match. But I was playing these 3 hate pieces, and all of them are quite reasonable to have in play. The ones that exile the entire graveyard are a little better, because you can nuke the graveyard in response, whereas something like Cage stops them comboing, but eventually they can destroy it and go off. Whereas with these, they have to be really quite cautious to not expose crucial combo pieces. And then here, Pyroblast, Red Blast, obviously quite good. Misstep's quite good, and there's a bit of a discussion I had with a couple of people about whether or not to board in the Blue Elemental and the Hydro Blasts, because at that point you're up to 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 cards is quite a lot to take away from the aggro plan, and you very much need to kill them quickly. There are obviously some sort of very easy cuts to make. Royal Scions is not doing anything. Some of the burn spells like Skewer the Critics are also similarly clunky. Josephine's Prodigy, despite being a very powerful magic card, is not really what you want to do in this matchup, etc, etc. The issue I thought is that these cards counter very few cards in my opponent's deck. It's just the ones they hit are incredibly powerful. Destroying or countering their Underworld Breach when they have LED on the stack, or they've done something to begin comboing, is potentially game winning because they've binned their hand to the card. So you do have to bear that in mind. I didn't board them in. I think it does depend a lot on whether your opponent boards in their Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast for your blue cards, therefore giving you an extra 2 high impact targets. And if they do, I could certainly see it, or at least boarding in one of them and reevaluating. But here we are. So game 2, we get to be on the play, which is quite nice. And we'll take 7 cards at some point. So this was the 7, and this is a pretty interesting hand. If you keep it, you've got Eidolon on turn 2, but you've got to put a Fireblast or a Pyroblast, probably the Fireblast, under Chrome Mox to do it, which is not ideal. Excuse me. If you keep this hand, it's basically turn 2 Eidolon, hold up Pyroblast, and hope that's good enough. You sort of have the backdoor Mishra's Factory for 4-6 points of damage because you're not doing anything else with your mana. But this is a hand that really lives and dies by Eidolon the Great Revel. If I could play this turn 1 on the play, I would absolutely have kept the hand. So if this was Steam Vents, Volcanic Island, Basic Mountain, I would have kept. But yeah, I think this hand's interesting. I shipped it, and I was rewarded with this hand, which is significantly better. So I misclicked and shipped it again. And this was the 5 I got, which is slightly better than the last one. I really didn't feel like going to 4. 4 cards, is a bit better in this deck where you're playing Mox and an obnoxious 3-drops, but it's a pretty low resource base to start the game from. I'm genuinely unsure if this should be a mulligan or not. The fact that your opponent is playing Duress does make mulliganing worse. The fact that they're playing cheap counter magic makes lands better. So like Daze, for example, can be played through with this hand. But I think I would keep this. Anyway, I shipped 2 lands, obviously. And there's an interesting decision of, do you play Mishra's Factory or Spire Bluff Canal turn 1? I decided to play Mishra's Factory because I decided, if my opponent's going to kill me on turn 1, cool, I guess I lose to not having Pyroblast up. But I'd like to see what happens, give myself the option of dealing 2 points of damage and maybe stealing it with like Price of Progress plus Fire Blast if they're my draw steps or something like that. Certainly, you can play Spire Bluff Canal next turn and not Pyroblast. That's totally reasonable. And then our opponent fetches, I believe, a basic. Yes, they fetch a basic. So they're well aware that we're still trying to moon them. Although you could feasibly cut the moons on the draw here. And then they duress us, which is very rude and upsetting, especially when we mulligan to 5. So they look at this hand and presumably already planning out which turn on which they'll win the game through no interaction. We draw Fire Confluence, which is somewhat amusing. It's, I think, a reasonable card to leave in the deck. It's 6 damage, plus it shatters some artifacts, and then occasionally comes up here. Yes, but we're just shipping in with Mishra's Factory and hoping that somehow our opponent doesn't do anything for 4 turns whilst we draw some burn spells. Our opponent passes. I'm sort of filled with a little bit of optimism here. If opponent had Duress turn 1, nothing turn 2, their hand either has several interaction pieces rather than cantrips, in which case our hand just having lands is not as bad as it could be. As I said, you can play through Daze, Spell Pierce, etc. with this sort of hand. Or they're just going to, Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation next turn. But either way, we're going to find out very quickly. So Factory turns into an assembly worker and gets in there again. And unfortunately gets Fatal Pushed, which I was really upset about. Our opponent had the sort of, duress the Pyroblast, push for this thing, and suddenly our hand was actually just bad. Yeah, so again, tapped Water Grave, and now I'm still thinking the hand is probably just interaction, so maybe we do have a slim chance to steal something. I draw Hush Mentor, which, is no Eidolon in the Great Revel, but I think is, not unreasonable against an opponent that might have a couple of activated abilities in their deck, especially fetch lands. They have some strict mana requirements, etc. But coming down, turn 4 is, when their mana's already set, is much worse. They're obviously going to fetch a response in order to not pay an extra 2 damage to bolt themselves, and I fetch as well because their fetch land lets me skewer the critics and deal them sort of free 3 points of damage. And then they kill this in response. It's like, cool, they've obviously drawn the interaction part of their deck. But then they entombed. And at this point I just assumed I was dead. I read this as lethal. They got LED, which I very much read as lethal. And then I shipped the turn, and they played a land and didn't kill me. Instead, they tapped for Underworld Breach, and then sort of thought a little bit and just added Laris of the Dream Den to their hand. It's possible that they drew the card they wanted to entomb for, so they drew Brain Freeze. Like that's really the only thing I can think of that makes sense. The other thing I suppose is they just wanted to get Luris so that next turn they can Underworld Breach and play land, and if I kill their Underworld Breach, they can play Luris, play LED, recast it. That was the only other line I could think of them taking, but I presume they just drew the card that they wanted to entomb for. Then I drew Eidolon. I was like, ooh, maybe, one time. Maybe they don't have Underworld Breach after all, despite trying to tap for it. Sadly, I had Hydroblast instead, which, sucked. And I shipped the turn and fully expected to die here, and my opponent didn't disappoint me, so they play Breach. And now they can basically do whatever they want. They're entombing again, I believe. Like, I would entomb in this spot. Okay, no, they are LEDing first, sure. And then they're entombing. So you have to click through, with this replay function, you have to click through each of their decision points on what cards to exile. And then they entombed to put Brain Freeze in the bin, and then I was like, okay, maybe they're just playing a very conservative line last turn. It is what it is. Like, putting Luris in your hand means that you don't have to exile Demonic Consultation or Entomb to cast your Brain Freeze now, but I mean, I suspect that just decking me with Brain Freeze is good enough. I'm not sure you need to save one of these cards to kill me on the spot. I think just going off last turn was probably fine. But either way, it was the difference between 99.9% to win and 99.95% to win. Yes, we're obviously very dead here. I think this highlights one of the weaknesses of the sort of red aggro deck. They don't have a lot of key points of interaction for fast combo. And if you're thinking of playing this deck in a league like this with open deck lists, you do need to be really quite acutely aware that this sort of fast combo can get under you because your opponent doesn't have to worry about playing around counter spells. Leaving up open blue mana just doesn't really intimidate anyone when they can look at your list and see that you have no main deck interaction and you've got 4 sideboard blasts and a mental misstep, and that's it. So if you are thinking of playing this deck, you might want to add a Spell Pierce somewhere or a couple of pieces of counter magic just to force people to respect it. But otherwise, I very much enjoyed the deck, despite getting thoroughly smashed by Oracle Breach here. I still plan to run this back until the next round at least. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop me a line. Otherwise, good luck for the rest of your matches, and hopefully you watch some of my other recordings from the rest of this league.